This talk is largely about change, and it's also not incidentally about Puppet. I kind of submitted this talk title without thinking about it too deeply, but as I started digging in and thinking about what change meant in the context of Puppet, and I came up with a couple of interesting things that I hope we can have some fun with. There's a lot of different kinds of change. There are some kinds of change that are good, like loose change that you find under your seat cushions, and you can play pinball when you thought you had no money. That's like a good kind of change. There are some kinds of change which are bad, like climate change, which I assure you is real. Half of our country is underwater, and half of our country is in a multi-year drought. This is not a good thing. This is from flooding in North Charleston this week from Hurricane Joaquin. Pretty brutal. There are other kinds of change where you don't know what it's like until you're through. You just know it's super uncomfortable and it's not like what it was before. There's actually a framework for understanding that kind of transformational change in literature and movies. It's called The Hero's Journey. It's from Joseph Campbell, who studied the power of myths in storytelling. He referred to this myth, the hero's journey, as the monomyth. It was like the monolith, but the monomyth. It was the myth from which all other myths are derived, in his opinion. And Christopher Vogler, who was a script consultant for Disney a long time ago, summarized and sort of modernized this journey in a famous memo. He has a book that's called The Writer's Journey, which is where this summary came from. And if you're interested in that sort of thing, I highly recommend it. The way it works, and I'll just step through this very quickly, but the hero is introduced in the ordinary world, the mundane world, the known world. That's sort of the top third of the circle there. He receives a call to adventure. He or she receives a call to adventure. I'm going to use he in this, and I'm going to also, in the interest of full disclosure, I studied literary criticism in college. I did not study computer science. I hung out in the computer lab and played Doom, but that wasn't quite the same thing as studying computer science. It did inadvertently lead to my career as a systems administrator, but the thing I actually studied in university was literary criticism, and I've been waiting for 20 years to put that training to use. So today, you are all the beneficiaries of my expensive university education. The hero or heroine receives the call to adventure. They are reluctant at first to cross that first threshold down into the unknown world. But eventually, they pass a gatekeeper and go through a series of challenges and temptations. They meet allies and enemies. And ultimately, those series of tests culminate in the abyss, in the ultimate challenge, which often in the hero's journey results in a sort of death and rebirth, a regeneration. The supreme ordeal. Through utilizing the skills that the heroes learned through the previous trials and tribulations, he manages to overcome that supreme ideal, achieve a form of atonement, and then seize some kind of token. This is often referred to in the mythopoetic literature as an elixir. It's some kind of artifact from the supernatural world, which the hero then returns back up into the mundane world, and through doing so, helps the mundane world achieve a little bit of redemption or transformation. And that's essentially the cycle. You may have been thinking as I was describing that cycle that this sounds familiar to you. This is a popular framing device for tons of pop culture, movies, and stories and everything, a few of which I'll talk about as I go through this. But I'm going to posit that the hero of our story is Luke. Oh, no, wait. That would be weird. It's not Luke, either Kenize or Skywalker. But I should note that George Lucas was a huge Joseph Campbell fan, and all the elements of the hero's journey are present in all of the Star Wars movies. All of them, like note for note. In fact, it's probably more fair to say that George Lucas shamelessly plundered Joseph Campbell than to say that he was inspired by or influenced by him. Anyways, our hero isn't really named Luke, whether it's Kenize or Skywalker. It's actually Puppet itself. But the story does kind of, in a way, start with Luke. This is a wall of text, which I'm not going to read, but it's from the infrastructures.org mailing list circa 2003. And if any of you were around in the configuration management space in the early 2000s, you know that everything was written in Courier back then. It was a weird time to be in configuration management. At the time, the concept of repeatable convergent automation tools was fairly edgy, and the community that arose in the space also had some sharp edges. I recall personally standing up at one of the Lisa configuration management boss and shouting at Mark, pointing at Mark Burgess and saying, "You saved my life, but you also ruined my life. What are you doing?" Luke was mostly working at the time on a tool that's called ISConf, which was written by Steve Trowgett. The website at infrastructures.org and the paper that was associated with that, that's called Bootstrapping and Infrastructure, was a key, it was a Lisa paper originally. It was sort of a key milestone in the advancement of configuration management as a discipline. That website is pretty much preserved in amber from those days, and there's some hilarious quotes on there about how awesome CVS is. So if you're in the mood for a nostalgia laugh, you can pull it up. Luke essentially forked ISConf and rewrote much of it in Perl because it was originally written in Make, because that's what you write your automation tools in, and integrated ISConf with CF Engine. Then Steve rewrote it again in Python, and then the thing basically died. It was pretty academic at that point. In fact, much of the back and forth about philosophy, formal proofs, Mark Burgess' advocacy for promise theory, and amusingly, the execution model for Ansible, and a lot of the underpinnings for what we do today were laid out in these sort of battles waged across Usenix conferences and papers, on mailing lists, and in Birds of a Feather session. I call these days the tool wars. Everyone was writing their own tool and advocating for it in all of their, in the venues they had available to them. We had CF Engine, ISConf 2, 3, and 4, which were all different. Quator, which is from CERN, SmartFrog, LCFG, BCFG, the list goes on. There was just a huge proliferation of automation tools that were coming out at the time. And there's a hint in this last paragraph here that not all is sitting well with ISConf, and this is kind of the world that Puppet's born into. This is why I'm, as it says, this is why I'm either trying to make significant changes to CF Engine or write something from scratch that incorporates CF Engine-like functionality and ordering. Sort of some seeds there for what Puppet became. So we've at least moved out of the Courier and CVS world here. But this is Puppet being born in the sense, and a lot of people don't realize this, but Puppet was originally called Blink for a short period of time. This is the commit which was imported from the original track and subversion site that Reductive Labs ran into Git. And it was sort of the birth of Puppet at this point. I'd encourage you to go back into the GitHub repo for Puppet and check out some of the old commits and poke around. It's kind of like the Wayback Machine for Puppet. It's really cool. The interesting thing about this, too, is that there's a ton of stuff from this era that's still around in Puppet today, like the transaction class and the type and provider API, which I'll talk about more in a bit. So Puppet's call to adventure came a little bit later when there started to be a team of people, that is other developers besides just Luke working on it, flying solo and doing consulting gigs. Things are different when you have a crew around you. Lord of the Rings, by the way, is another great expression of the hero's journey. The call to adventure is so clear here. The hobbits, take this ring to Mordor. Like that's it, that's what you have to do. Tolkien being Tolkien, too, there's a lot of epicycles in the story. There's a lot of smaller cycles that build up, smaller iterations of the hero's journey that build up into a larger one. But I love this part where the supernatural push helps get them out of the comfortable, mundane world and into the magical realm. And Mary says, "It comes in pints?" Perhaps for Puppet, if you recall from the cycle, there's generally a mentor or a wizard that's involved. Perhaps for Puppet, Marcus Roberts here was the supernatural aid. He did have a stereotypical gray beard. He certainly spoke in riddles. He was the first head of engineering at Puppet and was a mainstay of the PDX Ruby Brigade, as it was called. And he posts these monthly hangman puzzles like this one. You can Google for PDX Ruby hangman if you want to see how this goes. Personally, since I was a lit crit major and a sysadmin, this sort of thing just blew my mind and made me bonkers. I couldn't even deal with it. But at any rate, there's now a company of people working on Puppet, and we've crossed over the threshold and into a magical world. Maybe it's the world of the indirector. We rammed our luggage through the brick wall and ended up at Hogwarts. Chronologically, this is about 2008, and in terms of the hero's journey, this is when Puppet gains allies and enemies and undergoes challenges. Some of those are obvious, and some of them are subtle. Puppet at this point had a huge explosion in functionality, and indeed sort of emerged from the pre-alpha stage and began to be used in large-scale production. This is my slide that graphs the amount of Puppet we got over time. I subtitled this the Give Edward Tufte an Aneurysm slide because I love data visualization, and I really love really bad data visualization. And this is kind of the worst data visualization I could come up with. It's the amount of Puppet over time, as determined by the version number on Puppet, which of course is the appropriate metric for how much Puppet you're getting. Somewhere between 2009 and 2010, Luke decided that that pre-1.0 number was pretty inaccurate, and the next major release of Puppet became not 0.26, but 2.6. So suddenly we got 10 times more Puppet in one version, as you can see from the graph there. Then in 2.6 to 2.7, there was a lot of features that were being added, but they weren't really semantically versioned in the sense that we think of today. Breaking changes would occasionally creep in. And there's a ton of change here, despite the shallow slope in the line, so perhaps this isn't completely accurate. But by the time 3.0 rolled around in September 2012, we had to hew closely to semantic versioning. So it's x.y.z with features in y, patches in z's, and breaking changes only in the x version. That started with 3, and we released 3.0 through 3.8. with pretty tight adherence and a lot of innovation in their directory environments, feature parser behind a configuration flag performance boost. And concurrently with Puppet's growth, there were, we gained some allies in the form of some other ecosystem projects that became integral to the way what we think of as Puppet today. So the Matrix is, after Star Wars, it's probably the most straightforward expression of the hero's journey archetype in modern science fiction movies. Excepting maybe The Last Starfighter. Got any Last Starfighter fans out there? It's kind of a tie, I don't know. Everything from the visceral plunge from the normal world into the supernatural world in the Matrix, and Guardian to the Threshold, allies, betrayal, it all goes on. So this is Dozer and Tank, who helped Neo out in his fight to overthrow the machines. And I want to be clear that I have some pretty pointed critique of the way modern Hollywood movies implement the hero's journey as it's expressed in movies, and particularly in The Matrix. The only female characters are objectified eye candy. The supporting characters are the non-Caucasians who revere the white dude, and they get killed so that they can inject the protagonist with purpose, and they can inject his final battle against the machines with additional nobility. It's just pure, unself-aware, hegemonic filmmaking, and we could do so much better than this. Yes, yep. It's, yeah. But it's really blatant. It's right there on the surface, right? And the allies in Puppet's case are projects like PuppetDB and Hyra. They're helping move Puppet along and arose in response to problems that users were having with scale and complexity. But there are also enemies, and some of those enemies are Puppet's past self, or echoes of Puppet's past self. Performance, for instance. This is a graph from my friend Owen Megan, who works at Brightroll. I worked with him when we were both at Danger. And Brightroll is now a part of Yahoo, I guess. So I'm sorry, Owen, but there you go. Anyways, they were running Puppet 2.7, and they're having really bad performance problems. So this is their catalog compilation time, average, max, and minimum across the Puppet master bank. There was huge variability in that max time. Agents were running into timeouts. There was all kinds of badness. Owen did some digging and found that by reducing the number of passenger workers that were running and shortening the lifetime that they lived by lowering the passenger max requests, he was able to get that max time down pretty dramatically, and you can see that on the graph. Lower overall CPU usage, way more predictability about when agents rolled out their catalogs. He's got a great blog post about this if you want to check out his website at holisticqa.com. And it's not just great because it quotes me. I'll say that right now. And did some really awesome sleuthing on this. But my point is here that there was some creaking at the seams of the original scaffolding that Puppet was built around, like in the network handling. And there were other areas too, like dynamic environments and the language itself. People in the community had started to develop patterns like create resources that came up because people just weren't able to model the complexity that they were finding in their environments that they had to deal with by coloring inside the lines. So here's our circle again. And remember this, the abyss, the ultimate challenge, the death and rebirth, falling down into the chasm. It's necessary in order to achieve transformational change. And I have a gift for that. Gandalf here literally fell into the chasm. If you remember what I said about epicycles in Tolkien, Gandalf's death and transformation from Gandalf the Grey into Gandalf the White is one of them. And he gained a huge amount of power after his fight with the Balrog, right? But and he returned from the underworld. They literally fell down into the underworld to help the quest for the ring and return in the Two Towers. But for Puppet, in true mythic fashion, I feel like there's three parts to the transformational change that we're undergoing. Good things always come in threes. Three is a really frequent number in numerology. We have the three fates, three heads of Kerberos. What is your name? What is your quest? What is your favorite color? And three little pigs. You get the picture. I feel like for us, the three parts are the language, the network stack, and the agent, which I'm going to refer to in another trio, the word, the voice, and the power. This might be stretching it a little bit, but bear with me. The word is the language. So I used this slide yesterday at the Contributor Summit as an example of the kind of transformational change the Puppet 4 parser has brought to the language. I'm still trying to break my personal habit of referring to this as the future parser, which I did for the year and a half prior to it becoming the current parser in Puppet 4. The future is here now. But if you ever had to do a bunch of validate Boolean or is-string kind of checks, or compare a variable against a string of empty quotes, or maybe the string undef, or the thing that might be undef, the future parser, the 4x parser, is the balm for your scar tissue. So this example was written by Justin Lambert, who's a community member. His GitHub repo for his company EvenUp, you can check out at that URL. And he went all in for this module, which manages their Puppet installation on the type system in the future parser, and set a bunch of, and it was able to build an actual API to what the module looks like, because now you can assert right there in the parameter declarations what type of data you expect to see. And for instance, for that enum, you can see that it can either be cron, service, or none, and you can put that right there. And if somebody passes in a parameter that doesn't match, it will throw an error at compile time rather than having to weed through a bunch of problems later on. So you can check out this repo. Also, if you're interested in Puppet 4 language and haven't dug into it yet, Daniel Dreyer, who's in Puppet Labs operations, is talking tomorrow at 11:15. They converted a bunch of the internal Puppet Labs code to use Puppet 4, and Daniel's not going to hold back about the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's another trio. But regarding the language itself, I wanted to make a point too that there's a tough balance to strike here, and we've had some back and forth with folks about whether we're erring too much on the side of complexity and are losing sight of the simplicity and the ability to take a look at a piece of code or a piece of the Puppet language and make sense of it. On the other hand, compared to the create resources pattern where you would duck out of the Puppet language completely and into an opaque data structure, something through errors in the YAML file that would often surface it back into Puppet with no line numbers and no indication of where it came from. People were trying to do more sophisticated stuff with Puppet than the old parser was capable of dealing with. So in a sense, it's more of a balancing of the appropriate level of power for the job that's put in front of it. From a standpoint of the 3 parts of transformative change, I feel like this hurdle is pretty well passed. We're going to continue to iterate on the parser and refine some of the language features. The stuff for the orchestrator, which you saw this morning, is probably we'll go through an iteration or two, hopefully completely backwards compatible, but remains to be seen before before the dust settles on it. But overall, that part of the technology implementation, that hurdle is pretty well passed. The second test is the voice. And I don't mean the talk show, but I do love watching that show when I'm home, like zonked out on NyQuil. It's good for the soul. This is a block diagram of Puppet Enterprise 3.8 master. I need to update this for the latest, but I haven't done that for the talk here. You can see the network services are kind of moving and consolidating. They're consolidating onto the JVM and the network services and the data storage services onto Postgres. This part of the transformation, I would say, is about 80% done, which in computer science term, I think means there's 80% left to do, right? The CA, for instance, is remaining in split brain mode. We have both a Ruby CA and a Clojure CA that both run. And there's new services that are added for the orchestrator and for the code manager service that are coming out in the next PE release. But there's a consistent theme here, and the underpinning technology architecture is a lot more consistent than it was previously. Maybe since it was an all blob of a single big blob of Ruby code. The downside is, again, that this looks at the moment quite complex, and there's a lot more moving parts than there used to be. So one of the tasks in that remaining 20 to 80%, somewhere in there, is to simplify whatever we can, reduce the number of individual JVMs that are running, make it so that it can run on small footprint systems, and you can have a really functional server stack without having to throw a ton of hardware at it. Or virtual hardware, I guess. The final test to pass, the end boss, the PALA. This is the most intense hurdle, and this is Smaug. This represents the rewrite of the agent, the stuff on the agent. This transformation is going to need to dig into the deepest parts of the code that makes up what we think of as Puppet today, which is why it's saved for last. There's some foundational stuff that we've been working out to make this happen that just hasn't been possible before. So for instance, we rewrote factor into C++, which was an interesting exercise in and of itself because it's way faster now, and it can get facts out of using IO cuddles on systems instead of, say, running ifconfig and parsing the output with grep or whatever. But as a tooling exercise, it was even more illustrative because we now have the ability to build libraries in C++, to use a consistent command line library, to use stuff from the new Boost framework, which provides really nice modern language features like regular expression parsers and stuff like that into C++. And plus the server work that we needed to do in order to understand what exactly was happening when the agent spoke to a master. A couple of years ago, that network protocol was completely mysterious. It was not well understood at all, and the behavior of the description or the definition of the system was basically the behavior of the system. The only way that we knew what the API was by literally running Wireshark, decoding the packets, and trying to figure out why it was that it was sending particular things. Now we have a really tightly defined network API, which allowed us to rewrite the server pieces into the Puppet server in Clojure, and know that we would have good backwards compatibility, and that we can now change the agent to match what the server expects to see. So all of that stuff was sort of like level grinding in an RPG, right? Just stuff that you have to do so that you can get your character buff enough so you can face the final boss and not get stomped immediately. The way I think that the agent side rewrite is going to play out is like, first, a language neutral way to write providers. So this is something that we sort of kicked around as an idea for a while. Right now, providers have to be written in Ruby, and they have to run inside of the Puppet agent. There's a model that's much more like the way external facts work now in Factor, where you could have a provider which expects a certain data on standard in, returns a certain amount of data on standard out, and therefore it can be rewritten in any language that you care to. This opens up both the ability to have providers that communicate more natively with external systems like Amazon APIs, as well as that might run in a compiled language, run a lot faster the way that that Factor facts now run. The second bit of it is, in that case, and one more point there, in that case, the type in the type and provider split becomes much more like a data specification. It just says, hey, here's what your provider needs to implement. I would say the second piece is kind of firmer semantics around what's currently called the transaction class, which is the thing inside of the Puppet agent which says, which takes care of taking action on a system as the agent runs. Right now, there's a lot of mysterious magic that happens inside of the transaction. For instance, declaring no op in one place and not another may cause refresh events to propagate. It may not. It depends on the order in which they happen and how tightly bound you want them to be. So there's been some bugs around that. Again, this is sort of emergent behavior that happened rather than something that was designed in from the system. So similar to the network interface, we need to understand the way we want the system to work and then build something that implements that specification. And then finally, once that groundwork is done, we'll be able to rewrite the agent into C++ for speed and portability. And this is a couple of years out. This is not a near-term roadmap necessarily, but directionally, this is where Puppet is headed. The ubiquity that Luke was talking about this morning, the speed improvements, our desire to bring the level of dependencies on things external to Puppet itself, like even the version of Ruby that we're running, needs to be reduced down to as small as possible. And there's just huge upside to having an agent that, say, runs a really complicated catalog in a 50th or 100th of the amount of time that the current agent runs in, which is about the speed increase that we're seeing from Factor. So it's not unreasonable to think that could happen from the agent too. So that's not quite like an immediate rebirth and fire. It's a slow, steady progression that moves us out of the abyss and into a transformative land. This is kind of where we're headed with the direct Puppet stuff, and this will be a little bit of a preview of what Deepak will talk tomorrow, so if you're playing the Deepak drinking game, now is your time. But I think that this is more tech detailed than I think he's going to be able to go into in the keynote. So if direct Puppet was something interesting to you, either from the contributor summit yesterday or from the brief mention that we got in the keynote this morning, I think I have enough time to talk through this real quick. One of the main changes in direct Puppet is that the agent will send its current idea of what the catalog is that it has to the master as its first network communication request. And that means that the master can then make a decision and say, yes, you need to get a new catalog, or no, the catalog that you have is the correct one based on the version of code that I know that you're supposed to get. And this has the nice side effect of completely short-circuiting probably 80 to 90% of the amount of work that the master will have to do, because most of the time the catalog hasn't changed. If you run Puppet every 15 minutes, you push a change a few times a day, almost all of the time the agent checks in, it's going to apply exactly the same catalog as it had before. So that's step one. Step two is the check. Number three there is if the server returns mode cached and the agent applies the cache catalog. Now, if that step two determines that the agent's catalog ID is out of date, of course, the existing behavior will be retained. The master compiles a new one and sends it down, and the agent applies it. I would say there's a change, though, even in that case from the way things work today, which is the step 4 here, where right now if you have file attributes with file resources that have a source attribute that points at your puppet master. Every time one of those source attributes gets hit as the agent is executing the catalog, the agent makes a request for file metadata to the server, and the server then at that time has to scan its files on disk and determine whether or not it just runs through checksums for them. That could be recursive, it can be really expensive, and it returns that metadata down to the agent, and only then can the agent determine whether its local file is the way it should be or not. There's a couple of bad things about this. Like, number one, if you change those files on disk out of band from the catalog compilation, then the agent's always going to pick up the latest version of what the server has. And that might not necessarily match what you wanted. It might not match what was the file content when the catalog was created, so you can introduce drift that way. And secondarily, obviously, it's a lot of overhead on the server. So the change for DirectPuppet is that we're going to inline that checksum for those file resources as the catalog's being compiled. So the agent has an understanding every time it looks at those file resources, just like it does for something where the content has been inlined into that file resource, what the checksum ought to be, and therefore can compare locally and only make a request to the server if it's already determined that the file that it has locally is out of date or out of compliance. The second piece of that is that once that happens, the request back to the server for the correct file content includes that catalog ID that matches when the catalog was compiled, and there's an addition to the file service which allows it to retrieve the correct content from version control and return the correct content that matches when the catalog was compiled. So you get not just a lower amount of network traffic overall, but when there's a request for a file, we can guarantee that the file content is going to match when that catalog was compiled, and you can get you won't get drift introduced that way. Does that make sense? That's a lot of words. Sorry about that. That's the way it works. Yo. Yeah, so the question is, when that first check-in happens, if facts have changed that might cause a different catalog compilation. Again, the change is usually going to happen as part of a code deployment. So in that case, the fact that the facts have changed may cause a different catalog to be compiled, but the desire of the user to create a new catalog is sort of independent of whether or not the facts are different, right? We're kind of decoupling that decision-making about you need a new catalog now. That's something that you choose as the user by deploying new code. And the facts are more about what that catalog looks like when it's compiled and handed off to you. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay. Whew. So, another deeply problematic movie. Anybody watch Temple of Doom lately? It's really awful. Yes, the monkey brains, exactly. One thing you can say about Steven Spielberg, he doesn't go for subtlety. So here's our hero emerging literally from being underground, after his magic-induced transformation into a bad guy and his rebirth from, do you remember how he got, because he had to drink the blood and he got turned into a bad guy. How did he come out of his supernaturally induced bad guy state? Yeah, it hit him on the head. That's how you fix all problems. Amnesia, demonic possession, it's a cure-all. But he's bringing back the Sankara stones back up to the villagers. Again, the hero, which the villagers weren't able to help themselves, so they need Indiana Jones to come in and bring him back. It's kind of messed up. in the hero's journey, he's returning the elixir, the sword, the token from the underworld back up to the mundane world. He's emerging from the darkness back into light. And I can't guarantee that Puppet's transformation is going to be as pat and neat and wrap everything up as tidily as the end of a Steven Spielberg movie. I do think we're headed in the right direction. I think we're on a good trajectory. And personally, I'm pretty excited to see how this ends. That's all, folks.